Hey there, welcome to Up Next in Commerce. I'm your host, Stephanie Postles, CEO of Mission.org, and I am so glad you're here because today we brought back one of my favorite guests. I think he came on almost over a year ago, Taylor Holliday, who's the CEO of Common Thread Collective. First, this guy has so much to talk about. We probably could have talked for about 3 hours. So what I did was we created an AMA over on Twitter. So if you go to the link down below, go to the AMA post, and Taylor's tagged in it, and you can ask him anything you want. I think you can probably throw any question you want, and he will be able to answer it, and he will definitely have an opinion on it. So head to Twitter, click the link, and ask any questions that pop up while you're listening to the interview. So today, we got to chat all about NFTs. We went down a wormhole into NFTs, and I'll say at first I was a little bit skeptical, thinking about okay, where's this headed? What's going to be successful? But after hearing his opinions and thoughts of the future, my mind opened up and I saw all the possibilities of how brands can play in this space. Plus, we talked about Metaverse and Meta. And third, we talked about Web 3.0. There's been so many questions about Web 3.0 and the Metaverse, and Taylor did a great job telling me all his opinions and thoughts on where it's headed. So enjoy the episode with Taylor Holliday. Before we jump into the interview, I want to give a quick shout out to our partners, Salesforce Commerce Cloud, who help make this podcast possible. You can learn more about Salesforce Commerce Cloud by visiting salesforce.com/commerce. All right, let's jump into it. Taylor, welcome back to the show, round 2. I am so excited to have you back. How's it going?
It's funny. We were just talking about that question off camera, right? How is it going? I don't know. What's the time frame? What do you mean? I've got 3 kids. It's chaos today. I got to get to Little League practice. First game on Saturday. There's 1,000 ways to answer it, but generally speaking, I'm doing really well.
All right. So you were on, I think, about a year ago. And so for anyone, first of all, if you didn't listen to that episode, it was great. It was probably one of our most my favorite episodes. So practical.
Good.
But since then, what has happened over the past year? I mean, and give a high level overview of Common Thread Collective, where it's at today, and maybe what's been changing.
Yeah, man, it feels like, what's that quote? Sometimes decades happen in weeks, and sometimes weeks feel like decades, whatever it is. We're certainly in that period now as a globe, right? As a global community. But Common Thread Collective, we're an e-commerce growth agency that helps consumer product e-commerce businesses grow profitably. And so we are about 150 people. Last time we spoke, we were probably 80 or 90. I don't remember the exact number, but we've experienced a ton of growth. I would say the last 2 years in e-commerce have been tumultuous, coming out of 2020, which was the COVID year, where there was actually immense a tidal wave of support for the e-commerce industry, and then into 2021, where there's actually been a lot of resistance in the form of the iOS privacy updates that everyone's experienced, supply chain problems. And so I would say from highs to lows, it's been an incredibly volatile couple of years. But in our business, there's actually a relationship between the volatility of our industry and people's desire to work with experts. So there tends to be, the more uncertain things are, the more people rely on experts and service providers like us. So in that way, volatility tends to serve our business outcomes in an interesting way.
Okay, so how many companies are you working with today, and any names that I may know of?
Yeah, we have an amazing amount of partners, probably across all our different service offerings, north of 200 different brands at any given time. We work with businesses as big as Ann Taylor and Loft, down to startups spending their first dollars on the platform. But we have an incredible set of partners, from Igloo Coolers to APL Shoes, Born Primitive, just so many different brands that we have a chance to work with and work alongside to help them bring their dreams and businesses to life.
Cool. Okay, so in the last episode, it was super practical, talking numbers. I mean, we went through formulas. I remember I was doing the math, trying to keep up. This one, it was great. This one, though, I really want to focus more on the future. I mean, that's something where when I'm following you on Twitter and all the socials, you're definitely big now at the point of you're in a space where you have time to look into that, which is awesome. I mean, you mentioned you're hiring team members, you've got a COO, and so you can see that your mindset has shifted a bit, and it's bigger picture thinking. And so I wanted to kind of center the conversation around that today, around what you're seeing and what you're, looking forward to. I want to start with that. What are you most excited about in e-commerce over the coming, I'd say 12 months?
Yeah. In a weird way. So right now I mentioned 2021 is a period of resistance or struggle for a lot of e-commerce brands. I like to say that e-commerce businesses are facing margin pressure at every point of their business. Rising supply chain costs, right? We all know that story, well documented, from not just the backup, but the inflationary costs along supply chain. right? We know that rising CAC or customer acquisition costs from the iOS issues are hitting businesses hard. And there's also rising labor costs. The supply and demand of people with skills in our industry is massively out of whack. And so in every part of a business's P&L, they're facing pressure on the cost side of their business. So what this does is it creates a period of struggle. But in those spaces, what it forces businesses to do is innovate. And so margin innovation is this phrase that I'm sort of coining of what businesses are being forced to do right now to solve for those problems. And that actually is what develops the resiliency of the industry going forward, is we find ways to be more efficient in every part of the P&L through innovation, technological advancement. And that's really exciting for me to figure out, okay, across every one of those portions of a business, how are they going to innovate margin into the future of their business? And so that's sort of the underlying theme that I'm watching play out right now.
Okay, cool. Okay, so give me some examples of maybe the most innovative, ways that companies are innovating on margins.
Yeah, so I think the most fascinating one to me is probably around digital goods and NFTs, right? Like, so this is a space where we're watching brands, and I think the best example of a consumer product business doing this really well is the Hundreds. So the Hundreds is an apparel business that has created an NFT project called Atom Bomb Squad. So if you Google that, their logo as a business forever is a little bomb with a face on it. And they created 20,000 of these NFTs, and they sold them. And they grant you access to private events, early access to merch drops. And they were built and each one was designed by an artist based on the legacy of the brand and the patterns that they use in their apparel. So a really authentic story. And why it's so interesting to me is, like, set aside, I know everyone sort of rolls their eyes at NFTs, but what selling that object has created was on drop, they sold them for about 0.1 ETH each. So if you take 20,000 times 0.1 ETH, you very quickly can see how much money, so that's about 2,000 ETH, right? At the current ETH price today of $3,000, you can, $3,000, right? You can see that's about $6 million, right? Like, very quickly, that's pure marginal revenue. And then the magic of the object is every secondary sale of the NFT, they make a transaction fee on. They get to, that's part of the beauty of smart contracts and what NFTs enables is residual revenue on secondary transactions. And so now an apparel business has a pure margin revenue stream that every day somebody's buying a secondary purchase of a digital object that has no supply chain constraints, no cost of goods sold, pure margin that's now flowing into their P&L every month that enables them to be more aggressive in customer acquisition, to spend more on product R&D, to do all the things that a lot of businesses are unable to do because of that marginal revenue stream. And so that model is really fascinating and empowering for an apparel business that, from a cash flow standpoint, if you run an apparel business, you know how hard it is to manage cash and inventory in an apparel business, and creating residual revenue like that is just lifeblood to a business.
Oh, I like that. Okay, I want to dig deeper on that one. I'm thinking about, for the apparel business, I want to know the exact example, because I'm thinking, as a consumer, I go and buy this NFT, I have this awesome design, super cool, and then I actually want it on a shirt. Then what? I mean, because my thought is I want the materials. I want, if I'm buying from, Lululemon or something, I want their materials. I don't want to have to go to a custom ink and put a cool design on a, I don't know, Fruit of the Loom shirt. So what does it look like behind the scenes?
Yeah, so there's so many different components here. There are instances in which you now control the IP of the NFT and you can do whatever you want with it. You could actually become a seller of that asset. I don't believe that in the Atom Bomb case, they actually assign IP rights, but in the case of the most popular NFT project right now, Bored Ape Yacht Club, if you own the NFT, you own the IP rights for that asset, and you could actually now become a seller of shirts with your character on them. You control that IP. You can do whatever you want with it. You could put it on lunch boxes, mugs, anything you want. So for the holder of that, you now have an asset that's IP that you can do with whatever you want. You can build a TV show out of the character. All these are things that are happening around these assets. But for the brand, going back to the apparel side of things, they now can do lots of cool things with that. What they do is, let's say you're launching a new collection of shoes. You can give those people early access to that merch drop. You can have private events that your NFT access and access pass to. You can put them into a private community group on Discord or Slack or anywhere else and grant access and conversation and get product feedback to whatever you want. You could give them a capacity. There's a really cool another mechanism of this world, and I don't want to get too lost in the NFT space, but there's this project called, I believe it's Mr. Wag Me. So Wag Me is a phrase, we are going to make it. It's an acronym in the NFT space that's just sort of like a meme cultural thing that everybody uses. And so there's this character, there's this character called Mr. Wag Me that's basically a store that you can bring your NFT to and print it onto objects. And so it's a way to take your object and put it onto shoes or onto backpacks. So now you're actually translating your individual asset into physical goods in cool ways. So there's all these things that are happening around these assets that, again, for the brand, it's just a new business model, a new way to think about distributing your asset, your brand, into a form factor that isn't constrained by all the models of the old world, so to speak. That I think for a lot of people, they're gonna create, in the same way that if you think about the brands that have grown really fast, the Pelotons or the Whoops, what enables their growth is that they have subscription software revenue on top of the hardware. So when you think about lifetime customer values, which enables customer acquisition, is that if you have recurring software revenue for my Whoop band that I buy, every month I get charged $50 or whatever it is, my LTV just keeps going up and up and up and up and up, which enables them to be more aggressive on customer acquisition and enables their continued growth despite an offset, maybe some rising CAC. So this idea of digital revenue, whether it's NFTs, digital objects, or software, is a critical part of a lot of brands' futures to help offset a lot of what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it always reminds me of the Mark Andreessen quote, like software is eating the world, and now it's finally made it into the commerce phase and CPG. And so when thinking about NFTs, like maybe what are some, because now that I hear the design piece, I'm like, oh, that one makes sense, and it makes sense for artwork and music. But what about other industries? Like, what are maybe some opportunities that you're talking with, your clients about that maybe are a little, contrarian or too futuristic, where people are like, I don't know if that's going to work. Like, what are you kind of playing around with?
So one of the big another mechanism I love is one of the biggest challenges that e-commerce brands face is cash flow management. So if you think about some of the Web 2, so Web 2 is just a phrase that denotes the period of the internet that we're currently living in. Think of it as like from the social media era through the mobile era as representing sort of Web 2. And the tools that got developed in that era to help with cash flow management, one of the big ones was Kickstarter, okay? So Kickstarter was this way in which someone could come up with a product idea, they could present the product idea, and they could sell people access to the release of the product before it was ever made. And why that was so powerful is because it inverted your cash flow, right? You got the money as a business owner before you actually had to pay to produce the product, which is generally the biggest problem in e-commerce is you actually have to produce the object with money before you sell it. And so you have to outlay a bunch of cash to a manufacturer before you actually sell it. It's really hard. It means you have to usually raise money or you have to come up with the money out of your pocket somehow. But what Kickstarter did is allowed a bunch of people to invert that process. Well, NFTs, in theory, enable the same thing. There's a company called Artifact. Artifact was acquired by Nike recently, okay? And they did a drop with an artist called Fewocious, okay? And what they did was they launched a shoe, an artist designed shoe. And they had 3 tiers of them. Just for this, I don't remember the exact tiers, but think of it as like platinum, gold, silver. And they were different prices. And the idea was you bought an NFT of the shoe, okay? So day one, you buy the NFT. One was $2,500, one was $1,500, one was $1,000, the shoe, the NFT. And then 30 days later, if you were still holding the NFT, you had a choice. You could either redeem the NFT for the physical shoe, or you could continue to hold the NFT if you wanted, okay? So think about this. If I'm the company selling the shoe, I sell you the NFT, which grants you access to the shoe. Okay, so just like Kickstarter, I get the cash today, and then I also make secondary transactions. But the difference for the holder versus Kickstarter, when I pay you on Kickstarter, I don't have an asset. I have nothing of value. I have a promise that someday you're gonna send me a product. But as an NFT, the purchaser now can trade that on the secondary market. So they could sell it if they want. And if they're like, I don't know if I actually want this, and maybe the asset has appreciated on the secondary market, I could actually make a profit off of it, or I can hold it and actually redeem it for the shoe when I want to do that. So this idea of selling pre-orders to products in the form of NFTs, again, is a better way, I would argue, than Kickstarter to invert your cash conversion cycle, because the holder has an asset, not just a promise, right? That they can actually transact with on the secondary market, and I make residuals on that. And think about places where the actual production cycle is like years long. So in wine or aged whiskey, where the actual process of making a 10-year vintage wine or a 10-year aged whiskey, think about brands now being able to sell the actual access to that aging process 10 years before they actually deliver it to market. And it trades on the secondary all the way up to the point of deployment. So this process of inverting the cash conversion cycle is another powerful tool that people are using this for.
Wow. Okay. Now I have so many like thought bubbles thinking about how does this change the secondary market? I mean, they're already, kind of like putting collateral behind artwork, and they already have platforms doing that already, but it's not in this model that I know of. I mean, are there other models right now that kind of work like this, or is this it sounds pretty new.
So part of the secondary market thing, so the cash conversion cycle is definitely new. And this is part of why Nike acquired Artifact very early on, which was a really prescient move by them. And the other thing, though, is that part of why Nike cares about this so much is that, in particular, in sneakers and apparel, secondary apparel and sneaker sales is a multi-billion-dollar market that those brands right now make zero money off of those secondary sales. If I'm Nike and I sell you sneakers and you as a sneakerhead take them and sell them on StockX, right now Nike makes no money on that. But if it's an NFT connected to a physical shoe, now when it's sold on secondary, that adds an additional stream of revenue from a market that they were not capturing any of the value of, that now they're going to. And so now Nike's going to start associating NFTs with the physical shoes all the time. And so that connection between physical and digital objects is going to become more and more and more common. And like one of the really cool things, like if you go to Artifact, which is rtfkt.com, rtkft.com. What you'll see is that every time they have some objects that are purely digital. And what they'll show you is every metaverse environment that this NFT can be displayed in. So part of this is now objects, if you think about an inherent attribute, like if you go to a PDP of a product page, right, shows you what it's made out of, right? Well, then the next layer of this is every brand's going to be responsible for selling you an object that not only can be deployed in your physical life, but can be deployed in every virtual world as well. So imagine when you buy a couch, you're not just buying a couch for your home, you're buying a couch for every metaverse environment that's part of your digital identity as well. And so that's going to become more and more of an obligation of businesses to be able to deliver into both our physical worlds and our digital realities.
Okay, so is there an opportunity when thinking about Nike? It's like a clear case because you own that shoe, you want to prove it's a real Nike. It's same thing with like purses. I mean, not that I own any of those, but like people want to prove like this is what it is. What about for items that like don't have that kind of brand authority, or it's like, but it still has value on the secondary market? I mean, I'm thinking about all these secondhand shops here in Austin, and it's like they have very high priced goods there that maybe sold for a lot of money. However, it's not like someone's like, I really want to verify this is whatever brand, like, I don't know.
Well,
Levi's Strauss.
I'll give you another example. So my friend runs a company called Fyrn, Fyrn, okay? He makes really high-end American-made, handmade chairs, okay? Like beautifully handcrafted chairs, okay? There's the part of the value proposition is they're built to last a lifetime. Like that's the point, right? So the idea would be that if you bought them for your home, part of the value proposition is that they should hold their value and that you should be able to sell them on a secondary market. So they want to create an environment for that. Well, not only does the NFT, in theory, give them an ability to connect them, but imagine 30 years from now that you could actually check the NFT. Every transaction of that chair's history is on the blockchain, and you could see every person that's ever owned this chair and where it's been. Every object now has a verifiable documented story associated with it. And so the idea that it's lasted, and this chair used to be in Austin at this rad restaurant, and then it accretes value based on the narrative of its use in history. And that's actually verifiable on the blockchain. Like that's really cool to think about.
That's amazing.
Right? And so this sort of idea, like one of the things that people talk about with blockchain is that it's like a better truth, right? It provides us a historical accounting for where things have been and who's owned them and what they were paid for. And now like the storytelling that we could do about that, like as a business with our objects, like it adds a richness and a history to a brand in a really cool way.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I also think now's the time when people are kind of longing for, wanting to understand where they come from and their families and where their items are from. And I mean, we had on a really cool company in the very beginning of the show called Sea Bags, and they were taking ship sails and turning it into bags. And it was a story behind that. I mean, they look like amazing bags, but it was the story that built up that whole company of like, this was on this ship that sailed here. And now we can actually prove that and show it and add the details that we want to lock in, which is really awesome.
And the difference is the story ends there for that brand, right? Look, we acknowledge that there's this value created by the history of the use of the product, and they're selling that to you, but right now that's it. But the truth is that object went somewhere and was used by that somebody somehow, and then they may pass it on, but what happens after the transaction right now is lost. Yep. And so instead, every time that the NFT moves, there's a documented, registered, verifiable movement and associated story. And so imagine every time the sale happened that you actually ask the owner to write in like some of their favorite memories associated with the product that now get passed with it forever. Right. And so it's like, here were the 5 ways in which, like, here are family's 5 best memories with this chair. Like, hey, we had a birthday party and here's a picture that I actually could add into the program. Like, there's just so many ways that you could enrich the narrative of an object in such cool fashion.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like they need this in car sales. I'm trying to sell my old 2015 car right now. And this person's asking me all these questions like, are you the first owner? And like all these questions where I'm like, can't you just like verify this somewhere? Yes, I'm the first owner, but like, why can't you just look?
That's right.
I feel like it could go a lot of places.
Well, so that's what the blockchain, that's why the blockchain is going to disrupt every industry, just like those. Yeah. Like if you think about our mortgage, our ID, our social security number, all these things are best served in a transparent registry that we can all verify for. Mm-hmm. But the other thing too is like when you start to think about the merging of like digital and physical and like what AR represents. So imagine this idea that you walk through a house that you're selling, and alongside the like verified registered history of it is like the ability to now pull up a video of like something that happened in the backyard. Mm-hmm. So now I can imagine like the birthday party that occurred here, and I can see the car, the kids in the back from a sports game singing a song, like whatever, like in a way that was like overlaid onto the object, right? And associated and stored with it forever in a smart contract on the blockchain. Now this isn't a object, it's a store, and this is my favorite definition of NFTs that I've come up with, is it's a store of cultural value, right? Like is what it does is it takes everything, all the energy and experience associated with that object and allows you to store it in there, right? In the way that like this photo right here, right, of my family, like why that's valuable to me is because that's Dream Day at CTC with my kids. I don't know why this keeps happening. With my kids sitting on my lap, listening to people inside of like they're all the feelings associated with that photo matter to me. So the photo is like indicative of the experience, right? And in a lot of ways, like that's what an NFT should do in its best form, is it should help to store and represent all of the experience associated with that object or that picture in some way for you.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I was thinking, Neil Gaiman, the author.
Yeah, I was just on Tim Ferriss this week.
Yeah, so I was just listening to that. Okay, the part in the episode where he was saying how his 2-year-old son took his fountain head pen and shoved it in the cast iron stove, and it's stuck there forever, and he signed like 2 million signatures, like book signings with. And I was like, oh, that'd be a good story, especially if you had it in the AR version where people could go and kind of see, and especially for someone like that.
Totally. Like one of the things I'm fascinated by, like, and I keep using houses because they're just such a place of memory. Like the house I live in, before we bought it, someone remodeled it. And when we first moved in, all of the Google Street View photos hadn't updated. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so there's this view of our house that like, it looked so different. And when we talked to our neighbors, they're like, yeah, that used to be the ugly house on the street. And they had this whole like history of this place that's really interesting, right? Like that's like the evolution of it is fascinating to me. And so there's this element by which all of that history adds richness to it. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, it's fun to think about.
Okay, so it sounds like you're very bullish on NFTs.
Yeah, we went down a deep rabbit hole there. Yeah.
I mean, no, I love that. These are the things that I always want to talk about and go deep on. So I'm glad you're here to do this with me. I want to shift over to, we can say Metaverse. I know you're bullish now on Meta. So I want to kind of hear your thoughts on how brands should be playing in the Metaverse, or, hanging out with Mark Zuckerberg on Meta. What are you thinking?
Yeah. So if you haven't, I would go listen. This last week, Lex Fridman interviewed Mark Zuckerberg for about 2 hours. I don't know if you listen to Lex Fridman, but he's just a very thoughtful podcaster, right?
I listened to 15 minutes of it. It was good so far.
Yeah. And I think it'll give you the best sense of what's happening here. Okay. So one of my favorite examples, because people think, oh, the metaverse, you're going to go be an avatar and run around. But it's like, we're missing the possibilities here. So one of the big things that Facebook is working on is they have the capacity to automatically translate 100 different languages in real time. Okay. So imagine right now, the only reason, Stephanie, that you and I can do a podcast is because we both speak English to each other.
Yep.
Right? And that narrows the scope of who we could have a communication with and who we could offer value to. In the metaverse, part of what this enables is you could be speaking Chinese right now, and we could have a full-blown conversation that we're hearing and receiving each other in perfect, understandable language back and forth in real time. Like, do you know what that enables in terms of the possibility of communication of us as a species? Like, it's incredible. And so
is that here now? I haven't gotten to that part yet. Oh, it's here now. Okay.
Yeah. So this is the thing that Facebook's doing. So like what people miss about the amount of time and energy and the technological sophistication is they think like they narrow the view of the metaverse to this idea of like, I'm this like clunky avatar and I have this weird headset on, but they miss what the digital layer on top of our physical lives enables in terms of human connection. And this is what I think Mark understands really, really well. And what Facebook actually is after is that their mission around connecting people is they understand the barriers to connecting people. Like there was even these fascinating conversations where they're so far ahead that they've understood, like one of the fascinating things they talked about was like, what is the actual experience of being in person? Like what is actually occurring that makes it feel a certain way? And so one of the things they noticed is that when you tried to build a digital avatar is that the really hard thing to plot was the relationship between your eyes, elbow, and hand. And that they couldn't make it feel normal to show you your elbows. Like they couldn't get that angle right and always felt off. And so if you ever used Oculus now, you'll notice it's just hands. And so they realized that when they removed elbows, it actually made the experience feel more human, more present. Those little subtleties of understanding what makes like the idea of being in person. Because if you think of all we are is just like sensory input beings that take a series of feelings, thoughts, visual inputs, audio inputs, like olfactory inputs, and process them. And so as we learn more and more about why, like we'll describe this feeling, you can't replicate what it feels like to be in person. And it's like, no, all that is a series of inputs we're receiving. Which ones matter to us? And so starting to understand those and be able to bring them to bear such that we could go into those environments, or like you and I are on a 2D image right now. We have a very limited sense of those things with each other. But we're going to be able to do that better in the future. And it's going to be more like being together. And we're going to feed off each other in better ways. Those are all elements of the metaverse that we have to consider. And thinking about your product in those spaces and how does it matter in those spaces is really important. Some of them, it will be really critically important. Apparel, different sunglasses, whatever it might be. Some of it will be less important. Food might not matter as much. I don't know. I don't know what it's going to be like. But beginning to think about not just like these like made up Roblox style worlds, which are a part of the metaverse, but this world in which the digital layer begins to deepen its connection to the physical layer is, I think, a really important thing to consider how your product fits within it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so how should a company go about auditing if they should even be playing in this right now? Because I've definitely seen a lot of experiences where I'm like, oh, it's like a virtual store and it's not good and it's trying to be really real and it's just grainy. And these are like the biggest brands doing it. So I'm like,
are you referencing the Walmart video that they released?
There were some more. There were some other ones that I've been playing around in that I'm like, this is just not good. I mean, I'm glad people are trying. That's great that the bigger brands are trying.
Exactly
but
right.
like, what do you think? Just like wait for them to try it out and see how it goes, or?
I think that like the thing that people miss about criticizing those things is what I just described about why Facebook is so far ahead of everybody is because they learned the thing about the elbows.
Okay. Yep.
Because they tried.
Yeah.
And so they know something you don't know. Mm-hmm. That creates a massive advantage for whatever it actually does become, is that in trying the thing, you learn what works and what doesn't. And so you refine and you refine and you refine. And so, of course, we have this like, our brain, like the way it works is like we just try and take what we know and we translate it into the next thing. And we like go like, oh, we'll make virtual malls and we'll walk around and they'll be like physical malls. But if physics don't apply, what would you actually do? You probably wouldn't need shelves if everything could float, right? Like that's an example. Like you don't actually need shelving. So like that's an example where okay, I don't need to build shelves if something can float. So like that in the process of working through the translation, you learn and you begin to get feedback from people about what did they love, what did they hate, what was amazing and what felt clunky, what was like awe-inspiring, what gave you motion sickness, right? Like that's a big thing with VR headsets, like, right? And so I would just encourage brands at this moment. It's a playground. It's not a profit center, and these are different things. Okay, there is your core business. Orchid, our COO, always likes to ask me this question because I'm a futurist. Is this interesting or important? Okay. Important means it's a financial implication of your business in the next 12 months. And interesting means it's not a financial implication of your business in the next 12 months, but we should learn about it and we should approach it with a learner's mindset. And so I think businesses need to draw a distinction for themselves about where they're at and where the metaverse or Web3 or NFTs play as it relates to being interesting versus important. And for most brands at this moment, it's interesting, not important, and they should treat it as such.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also fun to just study the companies or even like I mean, I really was pretty bearish on Meta. I mean, I was like, whoa, big brother, step away. I mean, people listening definitely know, like, I haven't been very excited about it. But after listening to that piece of that interview and thinking more about it, I'm like, okay, maybe just being interested and curious into what they're doing is a way to actually learn. And maybe it's not being interested in what they're doing, or maybe it is. I don't know. Same thing with the big brands. Like, what can you learn? Because a lot of them are like openly sharing what they learned, and you can just go into the environment and be like, oh yeah, I didn't like that. Like you said, like this felt weird. Let me just think about why for a second.
So I think what you're doing, like, I think that's such the right way to approach it is we can both have concerns about Facebook being the driver of the metaverse and what is required of them from a privacy standpoint, whether we actually want them to be the builder of it, and learn from the $10 billion they're going to spend in research this year. Those things can be simultaneously true, right? In the same way, I can read about Google's work in artificial intelligence and also be concerned about Google running artificial intelligence, right? Because there's something to be said for they are enacting a day-to-day effort to attempt to understand this world that I'm curious to gain learnings from and also to examine their view of it, So much of
that is missed, though. I mean, I think about all the companies. I mean, I worked at Google and I know all the research they did, and I feel like no one actually valued that. And you can still have your concerns, but I'm like, there's a lot of good stuff, and there's so much data to look at here. Same thing with at Uber, they had this really good chief economist, and he was like originally recruited by Jeff Bezos, and he wanted to write papers, and Jeff was like, no, you can't use any of our data, of course, like you cannot write any papers. And Uber said he could, and people look at Uber and they're like, oh, I don't want to learn from them, bad culture, whatever. And this guy has all these like brilliant research pieces around tipping and how to get people to tip and incentives and like so much stuff that a lot of companies could use when thinking about pricing models and how to incentivize people, but they wouldn't go to a company like Uber to maybe learn from it, which I feel like is a big missed opportunity.
Well, I just think that anytime when we paint with that broad of brush, we do a disservice to ourselves more than anything. Is that the reality is like Uber may have had systemic issues. Like we could say that, and also to say that all the individuals in there weren't bad or acting in bad faith, right? Those things can be simultaneously true. And then to say that therefore everything that comes out of there isn't bad, right? Like now, should we hold it? Should we examine it? Should we like be skeptical potentially? Yeah, like that's okay too. But to discard it, I think would just be a disservice to yourself. Like there just is probably value in somebody having spent a ton of time and energy trying to understand how to create VR worlds that feel real. Like that's just useful,
Yep. Yeah, I agree. All right. We've talked about NFTs. We've talked about Metaverse and Meta. Time to talk about Web 3.0 because that's an area I've tried to bring this up a couple of times, but no one has given me a clear picture on how to think about it because my thought was like, okay, you go into Web 3.0 as a brand, you're used to advertising in one way, finding consumers in one way. kind of can't really do that anymore there. I mean, you kind of lose touch in many ways. You have to start from scratch. So should brands even be thinking about this right now, or is it like too soon?
So I think my favorite definition of the transition from Web 1 to Web 2 to Web 3 is read, write, own. Okay. Mm-hmm. So Web 1 was just, we could read what was on the internet, right? Like we weren't an active participant in the creation, but we could consume, people could put things onto a digital broadcast and we could consume them. Web 2 was, we became the creators. This is social networks. We are the creators of the content. This is YouTube. This is everything else, right? Web 3 is we move from being readers and writers to we now own the thing. Okay. And this is a big transition from actually moving out of seeing your people as customers. Okay. This is a big difference. Web 3, your customers own the thing. Okay. They are the actual controllers and they reap value commensurate with the creation, right? So if you think about a social network, the idea of what a Web3 social network would be is that it's decentralized. The users reap the value of their creation. They don't have this exchange. In Web 2, there's the exchange that says, in exchange for distribution, you will take my content and distribute it to all of my followers. I will give you ownership of what I create. And I will not be able to monetize it. You get to monetize it. You get to sell ads. And maybe I give you a small royalty share in the case of YouTube or other channels. But for the most part, the disproportionate value capture happens from the entity. The goal of Web3 is to sort of invert that, to make it such that it's decentralized ownership. And this happens through tokenomics, meaning that there are entities like, I think a good example of this is OpenSea versus LooksRare. Okay, Let me stay with me. So OpenSea is the largest NFT marketplace, right? Meaning, think of it as like the eBay for NFTs. It's people buy and sell and transact, and OpenSea is the middleman that enables that transaction. They're the marketplace. And right now, OpenSea is centralized. They make all the money. When there's a transaction, that money goes into the coffers of OpenSea, right? Well, a competitor was created called LooksRare. So looksrare.org, if you go to it, it'll look like a marketplace like OpenSea. But what they did was they created a token, which is just a cryptocurrency. So it's a digital currency associated with the business. And they distributed it to all the holders that accretes value based on the transactions that happen on the platform. So now I, as a holder of Looks token, $LOOKS, now reap a benefit based on the value of that token. So the idea is that while it's not directly associated with it's not like a direct corollary to stock or the income value, the transaction volume does produce additional value for Looks, the token. So now all of a sudden users have an incentive to transact there financially in a way that benefits them. And similarly, if we go back to our Atom Bomb Squad example, if atom bombs increase in value, all the holders benefit from that financially. And so now you have, in basically taking the affiliate model of Web 2, where if you go out and you make me a sale, I give you a percentage of it. All of these people are hyper incentivized financially to promote your business or brand because they benefit financially from it. And so that's one of the sort of visions of this new thing. Well, whether it comes to fruition or not in totality is still yet to be seen. But I think that's one of the big distinctions is read, write, own is the big piece, is that the creator becomes the owner in this world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then how do you think that's going to impact like companies trying to start, and thinking about finding new customers? I mean, thinking about influencers and all of that, I mean, it seems like it's going to be a whole different world.
So I think that the directional creation of brands, so right now what we try and think about is Web 2 brands trying to become Web 3 brands, but I think the bigger threat to all of us is Web 3 brands selling physical objects. So I'll give you an example, like LinkStao. Okay, so LinkStao is a DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization. It's just, think of it as like a company that's run by code, not an operating agreement. Okay, so the bylaws are written in code in the way that it behaves, and everybody's votes their proxy. If there's 1,000 NFT holders, they all get a vote, and the code determines how whether a law or an obligation passes or not, right? So that's the idea. Well, LinkStao, okay, is an organization that was started to buy a golf course. And there's 1,000 holders of the LinkStao NFTs, and they're going to use that money to buy a golf course that all the holders will be a member of. Well, 2 weeks ago, they just voted to launch a merch store. And now Linkstyle sells apparel. They sell golf club head covers. They sell tees. They sell all sorts of things. And all the money that goes into the treasury is controlled and voted on by the holders of the NFT. There's no shareholders of the entity. There's no disproportionate benefit. The customers can be the holders of the NFTs. You got a built-in bunch of people that are incentivized to go buy all those things, right? Because they actually reap a benefit of it and to share it. And all that money then is controlled by the DAO. It's controlled by the holders. That's a very new business model, right? For products. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that become how brands get built, is they're actually going to get built by these consortiums of people that are already built in customer bases in ways that is going to be really fascinating to see what happens.
Interesting. I'm trying to think about the unintended consequences or like the incentives around, right now, like founders take disproportionate risk. And so if you all of a sudden be like, how will you incentivize people to keep building companies if, I don't know.
So that's exactly the question, is that does distributed reward distribute risk such that people have the incentive to keep going? So, I mean, in a microcosm, we're going to find this out at CTC. We're selling CTC. We're selling the company to our employees, right?
Yeah, I remember I think you told me this last time too.
Yeah. So we're running a social experiment in a very similar way, which is like, and now what I'll tell you is that there's employee-owned companies all over the world. It's not a new thing. There's a whole culture of ESOP companies that are 100% employee owned that actually outperform non-employee owned companies.
But did they start employee owned? I feel like a lot of them shifted to employee owned.
Yeah.
I don't know many that started out that way.
Yeah, I don't know the exact data on how many began that way versus shifted. And it's a great question of whether that initial driving force of the uniquely incentivized individual is important. Because I'll tell you, that's a narrative. That's a capitalistic narrative that I think you could argue is a mechanism, an argument for consolidating power into the hands of a few people, is that I need this motivation because I'm taking on disproportionate risk. And so that's why I must reap disproportionate reward. And the jury's out. I think this is a big thing that Web3 is going to put to the test, is can you actually distribute that risk? And will the effort that's required to actually solve these things, will the network effect created by a bunch of people offset that effort required? And I think it's going to be a big test in Web3.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. So the last question I have for you is, what's the most contrarian opinion you have around e-commerce right now? Like, what do you say on Twitter that people are like, go away, Taylor, we don't want to hear from you?
I mean, a lot of things, but I would say I'm like, one of everybody's favorite things to talk about right now is diversification of your media mix. And I just think it's like a swan song for death. Like, it's a siren call to die. Like, people think that Facebook was somehow uniquely affected by iOS updates, but they weren't. It was every app is subject to the same policies. And so there's this excitement about TikTok or Snapchat or YouTube as a substitute or answer for the problems that Facebook's facing, and it's not. The diversification will kill most brands. The attempt to move dollars out of that channel into another one in a lower performing area will really hurt them, and it's going to pendulum swing back and forth. I really believe that there's going to be a boomerang back to a realization of just how good we've had it and just how effective Facebook is relative to everything else. So I just did this big thread the other day about 10 reasons why public sentiment for Meta is going to change. And part of it is just trying to be provocative and doing a thought exercise for myself. But that's a big one, I think. And then the other is I think one of the ones that I've shifted on is that in D2C, we have no idea what brand awareness actually means. Or at the scale at which it actually is required. And this is a thing I've learned when I've started working with a big retail brand like Ann Taylor Loft, having a store in every mall in America for a long time is what that actually does to people's awareness of who you are relative to a lot of I see $30 million D2C brands talk about brand awareness, and their brand awareness is basically zero. Basically nobody knows who they are in the context of things relative to some of these other brands. And there's so far to go, and retail is such a powerful tool for generating brand awareness still, that I think we've and I don't know if this is super contrarian. I think the world is actually starting to come around to this position. So that's the second one, that retail is a critical part of building an actual brand. And then the third thing is that aggregators are a horrible business model. That's what I'd say. Like that's a hot one right now that I've just lived that life to know the limitations of it.
Yeah, I was say you know best with that, so I'm not going to challenge you on that one. I feel like you already know all the details.
Which one do you disagree with? Which one you sound like you're anti-Facebook?
I'm not sure about Facebook yet. Yeah, I'm unclear. The jury's still out for me on whether I trust it or not. I am very for all the technologies coming out. I'm very into crypto and, blockchain. I think Web3 seems cool. I'm just trying to understand like how companies could play in it, just because I talk about that all day. So I'm just not sure about Facebook being the main holder of the keys to that world. And like,
is that a moral concern or a business concern?
Not really a business concern, more of like moral, like, all the details they have on people and just where these bigger companies are getting the majority of their revenue from. And so the incentives there and privacy stuff and seeing censoring things. And some of those things just kind of make me wonder of like, okay, who's going to be the decider? Which is why I like, oftentimes decentralized approaches to things. So I'm like, well, maybe there shouldn't just be one company kind of deciding, what gets said and what doesn't, or whatever that may be. So I'm not sure about Meta. I like the Metaverse, but I'm not sure about Meta.
One of the interesting things, okay, I totally hear that. One of the interesting things I think about privacy, I'm trying to figure out what we all want with this, because it's funny because blockchain is sort of the absolute inverse of privacy. It's basically every financial transaction that you've ever made publicly available to everybody.
But not tied to you though. Like, yes, you can see it on the blockchain, but I can't be like, that's Taylor's unless you made it clear.
Right. Or there's all sorts of ways in which people sleuth that, right? Like that's like outing you want to talk about, you can't out my financial transactions in my bank, but you can find my wallet online. Like it's possible, right? And then everything I've ever bought or transacted in, you can now follow forever, right?
You mean like tied to your name though?
Yeah.
You mean
because I haven't gone to great lengths to hide it.
Got it. Yes. Okay. Right? Okay. Because I'm like, there will be, maybe that is the case right now, but I'm like, there will be a place where I feel like that will not be the case. I mean, because I think about all the times that I'm using Venmo, and I'm like, I always put private, whether I care or not. Like, I don't want people literally being like, pay $30 to a cleaner or whatever. Like, there will be a time when I feel like the technology will enable privacy better than it has been like up until now, because right now you don't have enough everyday users using it still. I mean, I feel like Coinbase was the first thing that came out and everyone's like, yay, I can finally buy Bitcoin. But like when I bought it back in 2011, wow, that was like miserable trying to figure out what to do to even like buy it.
Yeah, and I think that's the question all the time is like, is the point of cryptocurrency and the blockchain to enable transparency or privacy? Like, and I don't think we're clear yet on what we actually think is like, what's the value proposition? Because a lot of times I'll hear this thing of like, oh no, like it brings transparency to political use of capital, right? So like, if we could see that if a campaign had to reveal their, wallet address and we could see how they actually use their funds, or a charity had to disclose their use of capital, but that's sort of doxing yourself and saying, I'm going to give you transparency to my financial utilization. That's like on an individual human basis, we're probably like, that's not actually what I want, right?
But so maybe from like a charity standpoint or politicians, I mean, you think about the man hours that go into trying to figure out like what so-and-so did with their finances in 2020 versus just being like, here you go, don't waste those man hours doing that. Like, and same thing with charities. Like, I do think that would probably put a lot of people's minds at ease, because I think there's so many ideas around like what's actually happening. But like, if you actually look into it, it's like, well, maybe that was happening 10 years ago with like, I don't know, Red Cross or whatever, but like, it's not a thing anymore,
Yeah. I think the thing we're gonna have to wrestle with is what it creates is an attack vector for every decision you make, you being obligated to the morality of every person you transact with. So like, imagine a charity. Like one of the things right now is that like, what it would open, let's say you run Black Lives Matter as a charity. Everywhere you go, what it's going to do is whoever's against you is going to look for improprieties in every layer of your transactional supply chain, right? Like, and the second somebody is doing something wrong, like we're going to reach this sort of like cancel culture moment of now you become sort of obligated to every transaction. Which is that good or bad? I don't know. I don't actually know. There's a book called, there's a great book about this. It's called, I'm listening to it right now. It's called, Light of Other Days, The Light of Other Days, okay? And the idea of this book is we've developed this technological capacity It's Arthur C. Clarke. Okay, so the idea is we've developed this wormhole technology where we can have transparency to everybody's thoughts all the time. And you can, suddenly we move to like the complete spectrum of transparency. And so what happens is we've sort of reached the other side of cancel culture where basically like we all realize we all suck. And so what then? What do you do in that moment where sort of this like masquerade of like moral superiority deteriorates from every angle? And I think like these kinds of things, as we get into these layers of like privacy, transparency, pseudonymity versus actual identity, like because we're moving to a world where like there are characters whose entire persona is unknown. Is that good or bad? Like I don't know. Like so I think that it's just going to be a fascinating thing for us to figure out as a society.
Yeah, I mean that's why with a lot of these things I'm like I have strong opinions weakly held. Like for now, here's what I'm thinking, but if I find new information, I'll change it. And I mean, same thing with retail. I'm very bullish on retail. I think that that's going to continue to be a great way to connect. And one of a guest maybe a week or two ago, they were like, retail's cheaper for us to find new customers than it is online right now because online's so expensive. And I just think there'll be just different, unique ways to connect with customers with retail.
Well, I think a great example of exactly that is Fair, right? Yeah. So this is a perfect example of what's like burgeoned in this space of like retail discovery, right? Which is if I'm a small business owner and I'm looking for product, or I'm a product looking for retail, they created this marketplace that is sort of this like, you wouldn't call that pure like wholesale, like with a sales team going out to a buyer. It's digital, it's direct in some way, but it's ultimately a wholesale transaction. So it's almost this like third way, right? That I think that's where we get too like rigid in our view of things. And I think what you're saying, this idea of strong opinions loosely held, is that sort of like the principle of the third way, which is like there's always going to be a version of the thing that we should hold the idea that it could be better. So if we continue to allow for that possibility, then as new things arise, it gives us space to consider them. And I think that's important.
Yep. I love that. All right, Taylor, is there anything that you feel like we missed on this interview? Because I feel like we just covered a whole lot of everything, but like, is there anything that you really wanted to come on here and talk about?
I love this conversation. There's so much, I think, on the supply chain side that I think is going to be really fascinating on 3D printing and how supply chain actually works. And I think like what's going to go away is the way that supply chain currently works right now, which is like I order a thing from thousands of miles away. It goes on a boat. It comes to me. Like that's going away. I think a great example of this is like David Freeberg has this company that's like basically printing beverage recipes, right? So if you think about the difference between ordering a Coca-Cola and having it shipped across this giant supply chain into a liquor store, the basic component parts of every beverage are not actually that different. They're mostly water in most cases. And if you could build a machine that has all the ingredients, and then what we're selling as drink makers is actually a recipe, it's a software that you could then print basically the beverage. So at your house in 10 years, you'll be able to drink anything at any time. And it's just a software purchase. Like that version of when we think about margin innovation, again, think about the margin on that purchase versus all the dollars that get sucked out of supply chain. Like that to me is like a fascinating world that's going to happen. The same thing on the labor side with AI. Like there's just so much that all these things are so exciting that like we're going to solve for the present problems in such cool ways.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, it's also just been interesting seeing on the supply chain side of how already what's been happening the past 2 years has completely changed many companies' models, and people now thinking about like, well, why would I, have something shipped from overseas when I could maybe get the order, 3D print it right away in, New Jersey, and then ship it to the person right next door or something.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I feel like it innovated in a lot of ways really quickly that people weren't even thinking about 2 years ago.
If you think about one of the things I like to think about is like there's sort of Moore's law as it relates to the like technology innovation and the size of a computer chip, right? So it's like you can get twice the computer power, whatever the exact equation
every
is.
7 years.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Google. You're the technology support there. Thank you. I appreciate it. So what that meant was that when we grew up, like computers were gigantic, right? And then they sort of, there's a similar principle around manufacturing capacity that like, I think what ends up happening is what was a giant machine will become a thing that we can print in our homes in ways. Now there's constraints relative to the volume of the raw materials that provides like a chemical physics limitation. But at the end of the day, like we will be able to make things so much, like in our pockets, and in the same way that we can compute things in our pockets. And that will transform the way that supply chain happens, and will make software, again, so much more a part of how we think about product composition, and the way that occurs.
Yep, I love that. Well, Taylor, we'll definitely have to have you back for round 3. You already know it's coming, because I feel like we have so much more to talk about. But until next time, where can our lovely listeners and viewers find more about you and your futuristic thinking?
Yeah, I'd say Twitter is the place that I spend most of my time thinking and pontificating publicly, available for your criticism, at Taylor Holiday. And then if you want to talk, if you're an e-commerce business, Taylor Holiday or Taylor@commonthreadco.com is my email. I'm happy to chat there as well. So I appreciate the time, Stephanie.
If you're looking for the #1 platform for all things commerce, there's no better choice. So definitely go check it out at salesforce.com/commerce.